My name is Susan Bandies. I'm curator of the exhibition Portray Artists, which focuses on 20th century works of art from the Kresge Art Museum collection at Michigan State University. There are a number of ways in which to look at the exhibition, from the people who are portrayed, to the techniques that are used, to the relationship between objects as they're hung on the wall. So I'd like to give a little introduction and invite all to come and see the exhibition. There are many famous names of the 20th century who were included in the exhibition. Chuck Close, Cindy Sherman, Alex Katz, and there are others who are not as well known, but should be better known. The artists who have made the objects in the exhibition either portray themselves, self-portraits, or portray other artists who might be musicians, dancers, photographers, writers, poets. So we define artists very largely to include a variety of professions. The works begin in the early 20th century. There is a self-portrait by M.C. Escher, which is unusual if one thinks about Escher's mainly geometric, repetitive designs. There are others that portray dancers, and you can see a range of Isadora Duncan, the most famous dancer of the early 20th century, who really is the mother of modern dance. Her portrayals, two of them are drawings by Abraham Walkowitz, an important American artist of the early 20th century. And he was just enamored of her and shows her dancing in her toga-like dress and her bare feet, something rather scandalous for the early 20th century. But compared to her, right next to her is an image of Martha Graham, who by the early 1940s had really established modern dance as a viable art form. Her portrayal by the photographer Barbara Morgan shows no head, but from the neck down to her feet, in a knitted tubular dress with a focus on her torso. Now, if one doesn't know Martha Graham, one immediately, however, understands that this is not ballet, not a ballet star who's being portrayed. Martha Graham focused on the importance of the torso and how all movement emanates from the torso. And this photograph does that as well in a very subtle way. There is a portrait of John Copeland's. This is a photograph, rather large, and again we see a focus on the torso from the chest down and cut off at the thighs. John Copeland's did this self-portrait when he was well into his 70s, and one sees an elderly body full of wrinkles, scars, rather hairy. It could at first look rather abstract or almost surreal. Copeland's decided that after a very long career as an art journalist and publisher and printer, that he wanted to do his own art, and what better subject than his own aging body. So this is an example of a very straightforward, unidealized body, clearly in old age. And he continued to do photographs of himself like this, isolating parts of his body, his hands, his ankles, his buttocks. And once you see one, you kind of recognize who he is without, again, seeing his head, which almost never appears in his photographs. Another portrait of an artist in old age is one of the examples included in the exhibition by Katie Kollwitz, the German artist, primarily printmaker, and she's wonderful in terms of her technique. She is in a tradition of artists who portrayed themselves very often. Another artist who really began the tradition is Rembrandt in the 17th century. And Katie Kollwitz, like Rembrandt, looks at herself in old age. We see her in profile. This is a lithograph, wonderfully grainy, crayon-looking print in which, again, the eyes are sagging. There are big bags under her eyes. And we realize that it certainly is a woman who looks at herself very carefully, knows who she is, has penetrated deep into her own psychology. And I think that comes through in the image. There are other photographers and artists in the exhibition who use their self-portrait, but they don't really talk about themselves as doing self-portraits. A good example is Cindy Sherman, who throughout her artistic career of some 35, 40 years now, has only visualized herself, but in various get-ups. She is play acting. She wears wigs, she puts on false noses, she makes herself into other characters who tend to have stories, but what those stories are, we're not always certain. What happened before, what happens after, she leaves all of this up to our imagination. And there's an interesting example of her photographs of herself in the exhibition. Chuck Close is another very well-known 20th century artist who shows himself in a large print in the exhibition, which is unusually done in a rather reverse of the typical print making. It's done in white ink on black paper. One example by Jim Dine, also a negative image in which he's done an etching printed in white ink on black paper, which produces a rather ghostly effect. It's almost as if we're seeing the lines of his face underneath the skin. In getting back to the example of Chuck Close, he does images of well-known artists who are mainly his friends. He doesn't work on commission. And he also only gives a first name for the images that he does. So Alex, we know, is Alex Katz, for example. But Chuck Close's image of himself is really about surface and technique and the way he moves from a photograph. He puts a grid on the photograph and then goes grid by grid onto another technique, or using another technique. And he did that in this case, enabling himself to blow up the image to far larger than his normal size. So it's interesting to get up close to the image and look at the details and then move far away and the image coalesces.